Today's story, The Haunting of Ravenshire. We have also added this story to our playlist, where you can find all our channel stories at one place for your convenience. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, draping the small town of Ravenshire in a shroud of eerie silence. It was on nights like this that the townsfolk spoke in hushed whispers about the old Blackwood Manor, a crumbling estate that loomed on the edge of town. Its reputation for being cursed had kept it empty for decades, but tonight, something was different. Sarah Lawson drove her rusted sedan up the winding, overgrown path leading to the manor. The car's headlights pierced through the fog, casting an otherworldly glow on the encroaching darkness. Sarah, a budding journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth behind local legends, was determined to investigate the manor's mysteries. Her latest story was meant to be her big break, but as she approached the looming structure, she couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. The manor was a formidable silhouette against the darkened sky, its once grand architecture now reduced to a decaying relic of the past. The roof sagged in places, and ivy had claimed much of the facade. The wrought iron gates, twisted and rusty, groaned on their hinges as Sarah pushed them open, the sound echoing through the dense fog like a mournful wail. Sarah parked her car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. She adjusted her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, as she approached the manor's front entrance. The massive wooden doors, adorned with intricate carvings of grotesque faces, stood ajar as if inviting her in. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed the doors open. They creaked loudly, a sound that seemed to resonate with the very soul of the manor. The interior was bathed in shadows, the air heavy with dust and the musty scent of abandonment. Her flashlight revealed faded wallpaper peeling away from the walls, and cobwebs hanging like ghostly drapes from the ceiling. The grand foyer was a cavernous space, dominated by a grand staircase that spiraled upwards into the darkness. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she crossed the marble floor, her light revealing tarnished chandeliers and ancient portraits of stern-faced ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. As she began her investigation, Sarah noticed an odd feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the portraits. It was as though the house itself was alive, its presence palpable in the cold drafts that whispered through the halls. Her flashlight flickered intermittently, as though struggling to maintain its connection to reality. Sarah moved cautiously through the manor, documenting her findings and taking notes. She ventured into a large library lined with decaying books and dusty shelves. As she sifted through the scattered volumes, a sudden cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing her flashlight and plunging her into darkness. Panic set in as Sarah fumbled for her spare flashlight, the silence now oppressive and almost suffocating. Just as she managed to turn it back on, she noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and writhe, forming shapes that danced just beyond the reach of her light. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of the bizarre phenomena. She turned her attention to a large, ornate mirror that stood in the corner of the room. Its surface was cloudy and tarnished, but as she approached, she noticed a faint writing etched into the glass, symbols she didn't recognize, glowing with an eerie, faint light. As Sarah reached out to touch the mirror, a chilling voice echoed through the room, whispering her name with a chilling intimacy. Sarah. Her heart raced, and she spun around, but there was no one there. The temperature in the room plummeted, and she could see her breath misting in the cold air. The voice came again, this time more insistent. Sarah. Come closer. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself drawn back to the mirror. The writing seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the voice continued to beckon her. As she placed her hand on the glass, a sudden jolt of energy surged through her, and the mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water. The reflection in the mirror was not her own. Instead, it showed a shadowy figure, its features obscured by darkness. The figure reached out towards her, and Sarah felt a cold, unseen hand grip her wrist. She yanked her hand back in terror, her flashlight falling to the ground and shattering. Stumbling away from the mirror, Sarah's mind raced as the whispers grew louder and more frantic. She needed to get out, but the manor seemed to conspire against her. The doors she had entered through were now shut tight, and the once familiar hallway seemed to twist and stretch endlessly. Desperately, Sarah tried to find another exit. As she navigated the labyrinthine corridors, she came across a doorway slightly ajar. Through the crack, she saw what appeared to be a dimly lit room, its light flickering like a candle. As she approached, the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking in a dissonant chorus. Sarah pushed the door open and found herself in what appeared to be a small, dusty chapel. In the center of the room stood an old altar, covered in strange artifacts and symbols. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something more sinister. On the altar lay a dusty, leather-bound journal. Sarah's curiosity overpowered her fear, and she reached for it. As she opened the journal, the room seemed to spin, and the shadows on the walls twisted into grotesque forms. The voices reached a fever pitch, screaming in agony and rage. The journal's pages were filled with frantic scrawls and disturbing illustrations. The entries detailed dark rituals and forbidden rites performed in the manor centuries ago, rituals meant to summon and bind a malevolent spirit. The last entry was a frantic plea for help, written in a hand that seemed to tremble with terror. Before Sarah could fully comprehend the journal's contents, a loud crash echoed through the manor. The lights in the chapel flickered wildly, and the shadows seemed to come alive, converging on her with an almost palpable hunger. The temperature dropped sharply, and Sarah felt an icy presence press against her. In a final act of desperation, Sarah grabbed the journal and fled from the chapel, the whispers and shadows pursuing her every step. She ran through the twisting corridors, her heart pounding as the malevolent presence of the manor seemed to close in around her. With her pulse racing and the manor's dark secrets pressing in from all sides, Sarah stumbled upon a hidden passageway behind a bookcase. She dashed through it, emerging into a forgotten part of the manor. The passage led her to a hidden door that opened to the outside. And she fled into the foggy night, the manor's haunting presence still lingering in her mind. As Sarah looked back at the manor, its dark silhouette loomed ominously in the mist. The whispers and shadows seemed to recede, but the terror she felt was unmistakable. The Blackwood Manor held secrets far darker than she had anticipated, and she knew that her encounter with its malevolent spirit was far from over. Sarah Lawson's escape from Blackwood Manor had left her shaken, her heart still pounding from the night's terror. She returned to her modest apartment in Ravenshire, but sleep eluded her. The manor's ghostly whispers echoed in her mind, and the journal she had taken seemed to pulse with a dark energy of its own. Morning came with a pale light filtering through the curtains, casting a feeble glow on the cluttered living room. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the dusty journal laid out before her. Its cover, now smeared with her fingerprints, seemed almost to throb with a sinister life. She carefully turned the pages, trying to make sense of the frantic scrawls and disturbing illustrations she had seen. The entries were written in a frantic, almost illegible script. They spoke of an ancient ritual intended to summon and bind a malevolent spirit, a spirit that had once terrorized the manor's inhabitants. The descriptions were filled with arcane symbols and dire warnings about the spirit's malevolent nature. The final entry, written in a trembling hand, was a desperate plea for help, revealing that the spirit had not been fully bound and was now seeking release. Sarah's curiosity was a dangerous temptation. The manor's dark secrets were more than just stories. They were a dire warning. She knew she had to learn more about the manor's history and the spirit it harbored. Determined, she decided to visit the local historian, Mr. Jonathan Reed, who was known for his extensive knowledge of Ravenshire's past. The sun had barely risen when Sarah drove to Mr. Reed's antiquated bookshop, The Raven's Tale. The shop was a quaint, dusty building nestled between two larger, modern establishments. As she entered, the bell above the door chimed softly, and the musty aroma of old books greeted her. Mr. Reed, a distinguished man in his 70s with a scholarly demeanor, looked up from behind his cluttered desk. His sharp eyes, hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses, took in Sarah's anxious expression. "Miss Lawson, what brings you here so early?" Mr. Reed asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Sarah took a deep breath. "I need to know more about Blackwood Manor. I found something there, something disturbing, and I think it's connected to the history of the place." Mr. Reed's eyebrows arched in surprise. Blackwood Manor. That old place has been the subject of many local legends. What exactly did you find? She hesitated before pulling out the journal and placing it on the desk. Mr. Reed examined it with a mixture of intrigue and apprehension. His fingers traced the faded symbols on the cover, and his eyes widened slightly as he turned the pages. "This journal," he said slowly, "contains accounts of an old ritual. It seems the manor was once home to a cult that practiced dark rites. The spirit they tried to bind was a malevolent entity of great power. According to the law, it was never fully contained." Sarah's heart sank. "So, what does this mean? What's happening at the manor now?" Mr. Reed's face grew somber. If the spirit was not fully bound, it could be searching for a way to break free. The disturbances you experienced might be its attempts to reach out, or to find a new way to escape. Sarah's thoughts raced. Is there any way to stop it? Any way to finish what was started? Mr. Reed nodded thoughtfully. There may be a way, but it involves a deep understanding of the ritual and the spirit's nature. You'd need to uncover more about the cult and their practices. I have some old records and documents that might help. They are stored in the town archives. Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Where can I find these archives? Mr. Reed gave her directions to a small, nondescript building on the edge of town. The archives are open to the public, but you may need to get permission from the town council. They are very cautious about letting people access sensitive materials. With a plan in mind, Sarah thanked Mr. Reed and headed to the town archives. The building was a stark contrast to the lively bustle of Ravenshire, a quiet, unassuming structure with heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air was cool and musty, filled with the scent of old paper and leather. After a brief discussion with the archivist, Sarah was granted access to the records. She spent hours sifting through old manuscripts, faded documents, and yellowed newspapers. The search was exhaustive, but as she delved deeper, she found references to the cult's rituals and their attempts to bind the spirit. The documents revealed that the cult had used ancient symbols and incantations to contain the spirit. They had performed the ritual in the manor's basement, a location that was now rumored to be the center of the spirit's resurgence. Determined to find answers, Sarah decided to return to Blackwood Manor. She knew that to stop the malevolent entity, she needed to investigate the basement and complete the ritual. Armed with new knowledge and a growing sense of dread, she prepared for what lay ahead. As Sarah left the archives, the sky was overcast, and the air felt heavy with impending rain. The manor's dark presence loomed in her mind as she drove back to her apartment, her resolve steeled. The final chapter of Blackwood Manor's dark history awaited her, and she was ready to confront it. The evening sky was overcast as Sarah Lawson prepared for her return to Blackwood Manor. The rain, which had begun to fall lightly, only added to the oppressive atmosphere surrounding the abandoned estate. Clutching her newly acquired knowledge, she felt a mix of determination and unease. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and the old documents, she was ready to delve deeper into the manor's dark heart. As Sarah drove up the familiar winding path to the manor, the fog seemed thicker than before, swirling around her car like spectral hands reaching out from the shadows. The manor loomed ominously ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. The gates creaked open with a groan as she pushed them aside. And she parked her car once again in the gravel driveway. The manor's entrance seemed to beckon her with an eerie allure. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself against the creeping dread that had settled in her chest. The last remnants of daylight faded, leaving the manor bathed in an unsettling twilight. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and entered the foyer, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banisters coated in a thick layer of dust. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the empty hall as she made her way toward the basement entrance. She knew the answers lay below, in the heart of the manor where the cult had conducted their dark rituals. Navigating the familiar, eerie corridors, Sarah arrived at the basement door. It was a heavy, iron-bound portal that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy of its own. The door was locked, but Sarah was prepared. She had brought a set of tools with her, just in case she needed to force her way in. She worked carefully, picking the lock with practiced precision. The lock clicked open, and with a deep breath, Sarah pushed the door ajar. The basement stairs descended into darkness, and a chill ran down her spine as she started her descent. Each step seemed to amplify the oppressive silence, her flashlight beam revealing the damp, cobweb-covered walls. The basement was a large, cavernous space, its air heavy with the musty scent of neglect. As Sarah's light scanned the room, she noticed the remnants of the old rituals, chalk symbols scrawled on the floor, broken altar pieces, and discarded ritual tools. The symbols matched those in the journal, their faded outlines almost glowing with a sinister energy. Sarah approached the center of the basement, where the main ritual had taken place. A large, cracked stone altar stood in the middle, surrounded by a circle of symbols. Her heart raced as she set her equipment down and examined the altar. The air around it felt colder, as if the stone itself was imbued with a residual malevolence. She set up her camera and began documenting the symbols and the altar, trying to match them with the descriptions in the journal. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. The shadows seemed to flicker and shift, and occasional gusts of cold air brushed against her skin. Her flashlight flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, as she tried to ignore the growing sense of unease. She turned her attention to the journal, flipping through the pages to find the specific ritual needed to complete the binding. The ritual, she realized, required several components: specific incantations, the drawing of symbols in blood, and the use of ceremonial tools. The last entry in the journal detailed a final, desperate attempt to complete the binding, but it was interrupted. Sarah's eyes widened as she read about a missing ingredient, a rare, arcane artifact that had never been recovered. Determined to find the missing artifact, Sarah scoured the basement for any clues. As she sifted through the debris, she noticed a hidden compartment in the wall. Using a crowbar, she pried it open and discovered a small, ornate box covered in dust. Her hands trembled as she opened the box, revealing an ancient, intricately carved amulet. The amulet was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Its surface was covered in the same arcane symbols as the ones in the journal. She felt a jolt of energy as she held it, and the temperature in the basement dropped noticeably. The whispers that had been mere murmurs grew louder, their voices a dissonant chorus that seemed to come from the very walls. Sarah took the amulet and continued her search for any other items related to the ritual. As she turned a corner, she noticed a series of old, tattered documents pinned to a corkboard. They detailed the cult's practices and their attempts to bind the spirit, confirming that the amulet was indeed a crucial component of the ritual. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the basement, and Sarah's flashlight went out. She fumbled to relight it, her hands shaking. The shadows seemed to close in around her, and the whispers grew more insistent, forming a cacophony of voices that filled the space with a sense of impending doom. Panicked, Sarah tried to find the source of the disturbance. The shadows seemed to move with a malevolent purpose, coalescing into a dark, shifting form in the corner of the room. The temperature dropped sharply, and Sarah could see her breath in the freezing air. The dark figure emerged from the shadows, its form vaguely humanoid, but shrouded in an aura of darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and a chilling presence filled the room. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew she had to complete the ritual to stop the spirit. Gathering her courage, Sarah moved to the center of the ritual circle and began to draw the necessary symbols with the amulet's power. The shadows writhed and the whispers became a deafening roar, but she continued, her hands moving with practiced precision. As she finished the final symbol, the dark figure let out a blood-curdling scream, and the basement seemed to tremble. The air was filled with a blinding light, and the whispers reached a fever pitch before abruptly falling silent. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and the oppressive darkness lifted. Exhausted and shaken, Sarah took a moment to catch her breath. The basement was eerily calm, and the dark figure was gone. She had completed the ritual, but the experience had left her deeply unsettled. The manor's haunting presence seemed to have receded, but she knew that the battle was far from over. Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the manor, the amulet safely tucked away in her bag. As she ascended the basement stairs, she couldn't help but feel that the manor still held dark secrets, waiting for someone to uncover them. As she stepped out into the foggy night, the manor's silhouette loomed in the distance, a reminder of the darkness she had faced and the challenges that lay ahead. Sarah knew that the haunting of Blackwood Manor was far from over, and her journey was only just beginning. The sun had long set, and Ravenshire was cloaked in darkness as Sarah Lawson drove back to her apartment. The manor's haunting presence still loomed in her mind, an ever-present shadow that refused to fade. Despite the temporary calm she had achieved by completing the ritual, she felt an unsettling certainty that her ordeal was far from over. She barely managed to get some restless sleep that night, haunted by fragmented dreams of the dark figure and the sinister whispers that had filled the manor's basement. When morning arrived, she awoke with a sense of urgency. Her investigation was far from complete. There were still unanswered questions about the manor and its malevolent spirit. Determined to piece together the remaining fragments of the mystery, Sarah headed to the town library to delve deeper into the history of Blackwood Manor and its previous occupants. She hoped to uncover more about the cult, its members, and the nature of the spirit that had plagued the estate for so long. The library was a quiet refuge from the chaos that had marked her recent days. Shelves lined with old books and dusty records filled the room with a sense of calm, an illusion of normalcy that felt increasingly out of place in her world of supernatural terror. Sarah approached the reference desk and spoke with Ms. Evelyn Carter, the librarian, who was known for her deep knowledge of local history. "Good morning, Ms. Carter. I need to research more about Blackwood Manor, specifically about its past occupants, and any historical records related to the cult that once lived there." Ms. Carter nodded, her eyes filled with curiosity and concern. "Ah, Blackwood Manor. That place has always intrigued me. We do have some old records and documents on the manor and its previous owners. I'll show you to the relevant sections." Sarah followed Ms. Carter to a secluded corner of the library where old archives and historical records were kept. The librarian helped her locate files and records about the manor's history, including newspaper clippings, personal letters, and legal documents. As Sarah sifted through the papers, she found a collection of newspaper articles detailing mysterious disappearances and tragic events that had occurred in Ravenshire over the years. Many of the articles were related to the cult and their dark practices, revealing a pattern of unexplained phenomena and unearthly occurrences. One article, dated several decades ago, stood out. It described a series of disappearances that had plagued Ravenshire, all seemingly connected to the manor. The article mentioned that several individuals had vanished without a trace, their disappearances linked to rumors of dark rituals and forbidden practices. Another document was a personal letter from a former resident of the manor, a man named Edward Blackwood, who had written about his family's struggles with a malevolent presence in the house. The letter spoke of strange occurrences and an increasing sense of dread, ending with a desperate plea for help. The tone of the letter was hauntingly familiar to Sarah, echoing her own experiences in the manor. As Sarah read through these documents, she began to piece together a troubling picture. The cult had been performing rituals not just to bind the spirit, but to harness its power for their own gain. Their practices had unleashed a powerful force, one that continued to haunt the manor and the surrounding town. Feeling a growing sense of urgency, Sarah knew she needed to act quickly. The spirit's malevolent influence was still a threat, and there was no telling what it might do next. She decided to return to Blackwood Manor to see if she could find any additional clues or remnants of the cult's practices that might help her understand the spirit's true nature. The sky was overcast when Sarah arrived at the manor once again. The fog had lifted slightly, but the air was still thick with an unsettling chill. As she approached the manor, she noticed something strange. The front gate was slightly ajar, and the wrought iron bars creaked ominously in the wind. Sarah pushed open the gate and walked up the path to the front door. She noticed that the door, which had been firmly shut the last time she was here, was now slightly open. A sense of foreboding washed over her as she stepped inside. The foyer was quiet, but the oppressive atmosphere had returned. Shadows seemed to cling to the walls, and an uneasy silence hung in the air. Sarah made her way back to the basement, her footsteps echoing ominously through the empty halls. When she reached the basement, she found it in disarray. The symbols she had drawn during the ritual had been disturbed, and the altar was covered in fresh, dark stains. The temperature in the basement had dropped significantly, and the air was filled with an unnatural chill. Sarah noticed that the journal and the amulet were missing. Panic surged through her as she realized that the spirit had likely been attempting to interfere with her progress. She scanned the room for any signs of the cult's influence, but the darkness seemed to close in around her. Suddenly, she heard a faint, whispering voice behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows on the walls seemed to pulse and writhe. The dark figure she had encountered before appeared once again, its form shifting and undulating as if composed of darkness itself. Sarah's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the basement into complete darkness. Her breath quickened as she fumbled to relight it. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, but filled with malice. As she managed to turn the flashlight back on, she saw that the dark figure had advanced closer. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its presence seemed to sap the warmth from the room. Sarah could feel an overwhelming sense of despair and terror as the figure drew nearer. Desperate to protect herself, Sarah grabbed a nearby piece of broken wood from the altar and brandished it like a weapon. She recited the incantations from the journal, hoping that her knowledge of the ritual might help repel the spirit. The dark figure let out a chilling scream, and the basement seemed to shake with the force of its rage. The shadows writhed violently, and the whispers grew louder and more chaotic. Sarah's efforts seemed to have little effect, and she realized that she needed to act quickly to regain control. With a final, determined effort, Sarah reached for the hidden compartment in the wall where she had found the amulet. She took out the artifact and held it aloft, its power shimmering with a faint, otherworldly light. The dark figure recoiled from the amulet, its form flickering and distorting as if struggling against the light. The basement was filled with a blinding flash of light, and the dark figure let out a final, anguished cry before vanishing into the shadows. The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere began to lift, exhausted and shaken. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She had managed to drive the spirit away, but the battle was far from over. The manor still held dark secrets, and she knew that she needed to uncover them to put an end to the malevolent presence once and for all. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. The manor's haunting presence had tested her resolve, but she knew that she could not rest until she had uncovered the full truth and ensured that the spirit's influence was truly vanquished. With one last glance at the dark, looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor, Sarah stepped out into the night, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The dawn of the final day at Blackwood Manor arrived with an unsettling quiet. The sky was overcast, casting a somber light over the estate. Sarah Lawson knew that she couldn't delay any longer. The malevolent spirit's presence had grown more assertive, and the haunting whispers seemed to have intensified over the past few days. She had to put an end to the terror that had plagued her and the town of Ravenshire. After a restless night of research and preparation, Sarah arrived at the manor with a newfound resolve. The basement, where the spirit's malevolence had been most potent, would be the site of the final confrontation. Armed with the ancient amulet, the journal, and various protective charms she had gathered, she was ready to face whatever awaited her. The manor's facade, though unchanged, seemed to radiate an aura of dread as Sarah approached. The fog that had settled around the estate appeared thicker, almost as if it were a living entity. She pushed open the creaking front door and entered, the familiar chill in the air reminding her of the trials she had faced. Sarah made her way to the basement, each step echoing with the weight of the impending confrontation. The dark figure she had encountered previously seemed to be waiting for her. The shadows that had danced ominously in the corners of her vision now appeared to be actively moving, as if preparing for the final battle. When Sarah reached the basement, the temperature dropped sharply, and an oppressive silence enveloped her. The room was still, but the air felt charged with an unsettling energy. The symbols she had drawn during the ritual had been defaced, and the altar was covered in dark, sticky residue. The absence of the journal and the amulet, which had been crucial to her previous efforts, filled her with a sense of foreboding. She set up her equipment and began to prepare for the ritual. Her flashlight flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the space with an ominous chant. Sarah took a deep breath and focused on the ritual, determined to put an end to the spirit's reign of terror. The ritual required her to redraw the symbols on the floor and use the amulet to channel protective energies. With trembling hands, Sarah carefully recreated the symbols, her mind focused on the incantations she had memorized from the journal. The amulet, now glowing with a faint, ethereal light, was the key to completing the ritual and driving the spirit away. As she worked, the shadows seemed to coalesce into a familiar, dark shape. The dark figure materialized once again, its form more defined and menacing than before. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and the whispers grew louder, forming a cacophony of distorted voices. Sarah's heart raced as she continued to draw the symbols, her determination unwavering despite the growing sense of dread. The dark figure moved closer, its presence palpable and oppressive. It seemed to feed on her fear, growing more powerful with each passing moment. Just as the dark figure reached the ritual circle, Sarah held up the amulet and recited the final incantation from the journal. The amulet's light intensified, casting a brilliant, purifying glow that filled the basement. The shadows writhed and recoiled, the dark figure letting out a piercing, anguished scream. The air crackled with energy as the light from the amulet pushed back the darkness. The dark figure seemed to weaken, its form becoming less distinct and more distorted. The whispers turned into a cacophony of wails and screams as the spirit's power was forcibly expelled. Sarah's voice grew louder as she continued the incantation, her words resonating with an otherworldly power. The symbols she had drawn on the floor began to glow, their light merging with the amulets. The basement was filled with a blinding, purifying light that pushed the dark figure to the edges of the room. With a final, desperate effort, Sarah completed the incantation. The amulet's light exploded in a brilliant flash, and the dark figure let out one last, tormented scream before vanishing into the void. The basement fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the malevolent presence was driven away. Exhausted but triumphant, Sarah collapsed onto the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The light from the amulet faded, and the basement was bathed in a calm, serene glow. The shadows that had once plagued the room were now gone, and the air felt lighter and more breathable. Sarah took a moment to collect herself before gathering her belongings. The dark chapter of Blackwood Manor had come to a close, but she knew that the experience had changed her forever. The manor's haunting presence was no more, and the spirit's influence had been vanquished. As Sarah stepped out of the manor, the sky began to clear, and the fog lifted, revealing the first hints of sunlight. The estate, once a place of darkness and fear, now stood in peaceful repose. Ravenshire seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Sarah made her way back to her apartment, her heart lighter and her mind at ease. She had faced her fears and confronted the darkness that had haunted Blackwood Manor. The town of Ravenshire could now rest peacefully, free from the malevolent influence that had plagued it for so long. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also shown Sarah her own strength and resilience. As she looked back at the manor one last time, she felt a sense of closure and accomplishment. The haunting of Blackwood Manor had ended, and the spirit's reign of terror was finally over. With a final glance at the now innocuous estate, Sarah turned and walked away, ready to embrace a future free from the shadows of the past. The dark chapter had closed, and a new, hopeful chapter awaited. Thank you for subscribing to our channel. You are awesome.